Hello. How are you doing? You feeling stressed? Not as much as I am. Okay. So I'm Dr. Flint, but you can call me Bev. Nobody calls me Dr. Flint. Apart from my brother, I make him call me Dr. Flint. Basically, you've said it all. It's all amazing. I think I'm preaching to the choir, but I'm going to play to my strength. I am a clinical psychologist. I am here to talk to you about mental health and mental well-being. Is that okay? Yeah? Oh. Right, so this is what I'm going to cover in 20 minutes. What is mental health? You hear a lot about mental health. I'm going to tell you what it is. Why are we talking about it? Unless you're living under a rock, you might have realised that there is a mental health at work revolution going on. Is anybody unaware of that? No. So we'll think about why. I'm going to talk to you about the cost of mental health difficulties. And I'm not just talking about mental health illness. I'm talking about the trials and tribulations and stresses that we all experience. And basically, can we afford to ignore it? The quick answer is no. So we'll have a think about what we can do about it, but then also think about what are the benefits to investing in mental well-being in the workplace. So when I say to you mental health, what is mental health? Please shout at me. What pops into your mind? State of mind. Anything else? Anxiety. Stress. Good and bad. Exactly. Thank you. My plant in the room. We all have mental health. The weird thing is that if we say, oh yeah, he's got mental health, we never say, oh yeah, he's got physical health, do we? Mental health is on a continuum, which I'll explain in a minute. But actually, I think Scott has already alluded to the World Health Organization's definition of mental health. It's actually a state of well-being and being able to deal with the normal stresses of life and be productive. So we're all striving for mental health, just as much as we're striving for physical health. When we talk about mental health, though, and mental health difficulties, you've heard that stat, 1 in 4, haven't you? 1 in 4 people will experience mental health difficulties in their lifetime. If we're talking about the severe end of mental health, we're looking at sort of, say, psychosis, we're looking at 1 in 100. Biopsychosocial model. I'm a psychologist. I'm going to share some psychology with you if you don't mind. So biopsychosocial model, have any of you heard of it? No? Okay, so biopsychosocial model was born because the traditional medical model was not a good enough explanation of mental health difficulties. So we make the assumption that we are biological, we are psychological, and we are social. Yeah? So why is this important? And why is this important to think about in a work context? What is work if it's not a social thing? Obviously, we don't go there to have fun all day and every day, but that would be nice. So why I was thinking about this weekend, why is this so important to me, sort of mental well-being in the workplace? Better late than never, but I did have a good old think about it over the weekend. I grew up in Saudi Arabia. Not many people know that. And I grew up my dad worked for a university. And therefore I grew up on a compound. So I didn't work. My dad worked with people that we lived with. So our social life and our work life, or Dad's work life, very much overlapped. And I think because we were being brought up, my brother and I were being brought up in a different country, my parents felt guilty that we were ripped away from our family. We didn't care. I was 4. But that interaction between work and life was actually probably more enmeshed than we might experience here. We spend so much time at work, we spend so much time with our colleagues, that I was brought up to make the most of it. And what I've noticed as an NHS psychologist, particularly in the last few years, we have all been on our knees. And I know that isn't unique to the NHS. We are struggling. We don't have enough resources. Our patients aren't going away. So getting that balance right is absolutely crucial. And this is where the biopsychosocial model comes into its own. It makes the assumption that our physical health impacts on our psychological health and vice versa. It also makes the assumption that our social situation, our families, our friends, our colleagues, our work environment impacts on our well-being, on our physical and our mental well-being. So I mentioned a continuum. We're all on this continuum. So what this continuum highlights is the difference between diagnosis and well-being. So at any given time, we are somewhere on there. Our boss gives us a massive piece of work with a very tight deadline. We might not reach mental illness, but we certainly might start moving up that continuum. We might start to experience the stress and the physical and psychological stress. We might be working long hours. We suffer a bereavement, and we have a normal grief reaction, so we're going to feel pretty lousy. But bear in mind that somebody, one of your colleagues who has bipolar disorder, I'm sure some of you out there will have a colleague with bipolar disorder, they might have a diagnosis of mental illness, but they can still be mentally healthy. So that's the difference. There's a difference between diagnosis and well-being. So, common mental health problems. So as a clinical psychologist, my bread and butter is depression and anxiety. So I treat people with depression and anxiety. My specialist area is actually physical health. So I'm always looking at that interaction between physical health and mental well-being. I've got stress up there in red because it's a common language. We all talk about being stressed. Some people might talk about being stressed because it's more comfortable than saying, I'm depressed or I'm anxious. They might not know that they might meet clinical diagnostic criteria for depression or anxiety. I'm not saying that they have to seek that out, but stress, common language. Stress you won't see in a diagnostic manual unless it's PTSD or acute stress reaction. And then, of course, we've got the far end. We've got our severe and enduring mental health problems. So you will have colleagues that have a diagnosis of a severe and enduring mental health problem. You just might not know it. So, why are we talking about mental health and mental well-being in the workplace? There are financial implications. We cannot afford to ignore this. It's huge. And obviously there are moral and ethical implications. We are human beings. Your most powerful and special resource is your workforce. Look after them. Has reputational benefits, which have been alluded to. You don't want to be that employer that people dread or that people avoid. But also there are legal implications, which I haven't shoved up there, because I'm not a lawyer and not a legal expert. But the Equality Act makes it very clear that if somebody has a chronic mental health condition, they are protected under the Equality Act. So if you're not sure, find out. It's worth bearing in mind that we do not have to disclose a mental health diagnosis at work. However, if we do want our employer to make reasonable adjustments, then we have to tell somebody. Okay? Have any of you seen the Thriving at Work review? It's worth a look if you haven't. If you're trying to convince the powers that be to invest a little bit more in staff wellbeing, the Thriving at Work review is quite a good one. So this came out about a year ago, and it highlights the cost purely of mental health. So forget about your musculoskeletal problems and everything else. This is just looking at the cost of mental health. Absenteeism, obviously very easy to measure. Costs us quite a lot. Staff turnover, also easy to measure. Costs us quite a lot. The scary number in the middle, presenteeism. Have you heard of presenteeism? So for those of you who haven't heard of presenteeism, what it means is being at work when you are not well. I've been at work when I've not been well. I can't imagine there's anybody in this room that hasn't been. So it's a very big and scary number, and we have to take it very, very seriously. But what I don't want that big, scary number to do is put off employers employing people that might disclose a mental health difficulty. Because presenteeism, it's not just your people who are very, very unwell. This is all of us who are coming into work when we're not feeling our best and we're not being as productive as we could be. So just bear that in mind. So the cost per employee is somewhere between £1,200 and nearly £1,600 per year. It's more in the public sector, and in the NHS it's about £2,000 per person. So we cannot afford to ignore this. What gets in the way of change, though? We cannot talk about mental health without talking about stigma. It is alive and well. However, probably 3 years ago, I wouldn't be here talking to you about mental health. Is that fair? I think we've come an awful long way. Is it James? You talked about training for line managers. A recent paper produced by the Business in the Community reported, they did a massive survey and reported that about 30% of line managers have had this training, which is up on 22% of last year. But we need that to be at 100%. I live in a utopian bubble, I admit, but we need it to be a lot more than 30%. We need to be able to talk about mental difficulties. Lack of awareness. Train people. Let's talk about it. We all have mental health. Fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. So the training I've done, that's what I get back a lot. Is like I'm just afraid of getting this wrong. I'm afraid of opening Pandora's box or opening a can of worms. The reality is then that fear of saying the wrong thing means that we don't say anything at all. Say something, but perhaps get some training so that you feel a bit more comfortable and confident in saying it. This isn't a work issue. Sorry, pals, but it is, because your workforce are human beings. They do not necessarily leave their life at home. Some people are really good at that. I am not. And I'm normal, apparently. No buy-in at the top. You have to have buy-in at the top. It's all good and well have a few well-meaning people, but go and show your CEO, show your senior management that thriving at work review. Show them those numbers. If anything speaks to them, it'll be money, even if they have no heart. They have big wallets, probably. Not being prepared for change. As the two speakers so far have talked about, we need a culture shift here. And sometimes that means change, and not many people respond to change particularly well. So just get ready. It's easy. Talk to me afterwards. I'll tell you how to do it. Tokenism. That's already been alluded to. Downloading an app isn't going to solve an organisation's problem. Having Sushi Tuesdays probably isn't going to solve the problem. It's actually a series of things which will make the difference. They're not big, expensive things, but a series of little things. So, for Thriving at Work Review, if you can't bother to read it, these are the highlights. So, what they have recommended that we all work towards these core standards. So, have a mental health at work plan or a mental health strategy. You could incorporate, it doesn't have to be purely mental health, incorporate it into your wellbeing strategy. Develop mental health awareness, which I've spoken about. Encourage open conversations. There's a wellbeing calendar out there. So we have Mental Health Awareness Week in May. We've just had World Mental Health Day. We have Stress Day coming up, I think, or maybe it's today, I don't know. But it's just embrace what's out there. We have, it might be Running Week. Running is just as good for our mental health as it is for our physical health. Good working conditions. Goes without saying, don't ask me to come in and do resilience training with a group of staff whose boss is an absolute tyrant who makes them work 15 hours a day. I won't do it. Promote effective people management, and that's where the manager's training comes into its own. And routinely monitor well-being. So James has talked about data. Data can be your friend here. You need to know if what you're doing is making a difference. If you have massive staff turnover, if you have staff who are leaving within 12 months of starting, that's costing you a huge amount of money. So look at your data, keep your data. So what might this look like? So this is what we're doing in our organisation. What we would like to do is create a network of wellbeing champions. So they'll get training from me maybe about mental wellbeing. And also we'll make sure that these people know where to signpost people to. Those open conversations provide regular updates on what you're doing in your organisation. Hold events, have coffee mornings. I'm not talking about group hub Tuesdays, but do it if that's what works for you. And good working conditions. I've actually got ensure adequate leadership training, because I don't know about you, it's certainly getting better, but in the NHS we tend to promote good clinicians to become managers. They're not always the best managers, but we haven't trained them, we haven't equipped them to do that job. So make sure that your managers are well equipped. But tackle things like bullying and harassment in a meaningful way. Don't just run one workshop, keep it on the agenda. I've talked about training managers. So just make it a normal part of the conversation. So what we're doing now in our organisation is in one-to-one line management sessions and appraisals. Staff will be asked, how are you doing? And it's not the how are you doing and then you're immediately thinking about what you're having for lunch before somebody's answered. It's actually how are you doing and meaning it. Recent research in the British Medical Journal tells us that if an employee can share with their manager that they have a diagnosis of depression, so we're just looking at one area, that they are much less likely to need to take time off because of their depression. And if they do, because it happens, they're more likely to come back sooner. So having open conversations is no bad thing. Telling your manager is fine. You don't have to tell everybody else. And then measure the impact of what you're doing. So we talked about promoting a culture. How many times can I get the word well-being on one slide? I only noticed that today. So have well-being events. Embrace that calendar. The work's already been done for you. So, well, not the easy bit. The easy bit's been done. So they've told you when Mental Health Day is, when World Mental Health Awareness Week is. As I said, include those questions in your appraisals, in your one-to-one meetings. If you are good at this, brag about it. Brag about it in your job descriptions, in your job adverts. For the cynics out there who think, well, I don't want to become an employer of people that are vulnerable and have mental health difficulties, I'm not allowed to swear, but I will tell you that that's complete rubbish. What you will do is you'll become an employer who is known to care and to value people for all their weird and wonderfulness. And train and support some champions, and particularly managers. So what you can do as a manager. So if you are concerned about somebody, or even if you've got a workforce that is fallible, we're all fallible. If somebody is struggling, involve them in decisions. You can make an assumption that they are an expert in themselves. So include them in their decisions. Don't judge them. Don't make assumptions. You don't know what's happening. You might be frustrated, but talk to them. Remember that self-compassion is not self-indulgent. Nobody can do that for you. Nobody can do that for them other than them. Provide mental health support training. You can learn how to utilise well-being plans. If somebody is unwell, you can do a return to work plan with them. As I said, they're an expert in themselves. If somebody has been off sick with depression or anxiety, hopefully it'll never happen again, but unfortunately there is always a chance that it could. So when they've come back to work, or they're coming back to work and they're in a good place, ask them in that moment, right, if you started to get unwell again, what might I notice? And what would you like me to do? And what would you like me to tell your colleagues? Put them in control. They are experts in themselves. If they do go off sick, stay in touch with them, just as you would if somebody was off with a broken leg. That is absolutely fundamentally important, having that contact. Because actually it's very hard to come back to work after a period of being off with a mental health difficulty. I think it's probably hard to come back to work with a long-term physical health difficulty, but more so with mental health. And be aware of your legal obligations. You don't have to be experts. You'll have HR managers. You'll probably have a legal team that can advise you. This speaks for itself, the opposite of what we were talking about earlier. If you get this right, you will see all of this. Deloitte, they wrote the business case that was attached to Thriving at Work review. So I won't read it out. You can read that. Basically, the return on investment is huge. And in fact, the biggest return on investment is on raising mental health awareness. So get some training in. Then the next biggest return on investment is proactive mental health support. And then you do get some return on investment on reactive mental health support. So I mentioned the core standards. There are 3 enhanced standards as well for the Thriving at Work review. And one thing to bear in mind is that these core standards may be mandated in the future, so get ahead of the game. They're good things anyway, it was a good guideline. But one of the enhanced standards is actually to provide in-house support. Did you know that the Bank of England have had in-house counsellors for 40 years? Oh, I do. I've just learnt. And they see about 10% of the workforce every year. I imagine they're saving themselves a huge amount of money. What won't work? Standalone interventions, tokenism. You know, just doing one thing will not make a massive difference. So that is me.